Have you ever wondered why you're leaning left or right? Is it your family, your friends, the media you consume, or is there something deeper at play? Are you actually born a liberal or a conservative? I'm your host, Timo Wunderlich. Let's understand the world a little better. With me is Rose McDermott. She is a professor of international relations at Brown University. She works in the areas of political psychology and has also taught at Cornell and UCSB. Rose, let me ask you, is political ideology genetically formed? Can I say that?
Uh, it's partially genetically informed. So, the first thing I want to be clear about is that when we talk about ideology, it's really easy in an American context to have that mean sort of Democrat and Republican. And when we do this work to look at genetic contributions to political ideology, we really mean it in a much broader ideological sense, from communism on the left to, say, fascism on the right. And so it's a much broader spectrum than is currently understood in the American political context. So when we talk about genetics informing liberal versus conservative, we really mean it in that broader sense, not just in the kind of Democratic Republican sense that it's talked about in America. And from that perspective, the work that has been done indicates that some part of political ideology is genetically informed. So it's not deterministic. It's really important that people understand it's not an essential thing. You're born this way or not born this way, but it contributes to the way in which political ideology is manifest in a given person.
And how much is that so? I-
Well, the way that it's done is usually looking at twin studies. So you look at the difference between identical twins and fraternal twins. And so there's a mathematical calculation you can do because, identical twins are the same person in two different bodies, right? And fraternal twins are actually like any other sibling set, they just happen to be born at the same time. So, because of the mathematical possibility of half, you can do a decomposition to see the difference that a genetic contribution can make. And then you further break it up into the part that's contributed by genetics, common environment, like growing up in the same family, and unique environment, which is things that happen only to you. And say, a particular experience that you might have with a friend or something like that. And you can break it down. And so when you do that analysis, you look at the difference between people. So the difference between, say, me and you, about 60% of that difference would be coming from genetic factors on average with
Wow.
regard to political ideology.
Now that sounds like a lot.
It is. It's not trivial. It's just not deterministic. And I think it's in the political punditry that I hear, you always hear these things where they say, oh, the gene for, like there's a single gene and then it determines it and you don't have any choice in it. That's not how it works, right? Especially with something as socially complex as political ideology. There's a lot of genes that contribute, plus a lot of environmental factors. And those things work in combination and in interaction over time. And so it's not like there is a gene. There would never be a single gene that would contribute something this complex. And it's certainly not only genetics. The environmental factors trigger particular kinds of predispositions, help people to self-select into certain environments, certain friend networks, certain kinds of activities or jobs that then continue to influence you in this iterative way. So it's not like you're born this way and you don't have a choice. You do have an ability through your environmental influences, the people that you know and things like that, to influence it. It's just that a huge, a not trivial part of it really comes from your genetics.
Okay, so what underlying factors then are influenced by our genetics that later on could lead to us being conservative under the right environmental factors? And like, what are the fundamentally genetically, I guess, traits that can make us different in that way?
Well, there's constellations of genes that contribute to political ideology. So again, it's not like a single gene or a single set of traits. It's a whole panoply of things that contribute to political ideology. And then, I'd sort of turn your question around and say it's not that things so much contribute to political ideology as political ideology drives a lot of other things. So your inclination ideologically affects things like your perception, what you pay attention to. Um, it affects all kinds of downstream things about how you see the world, who you choose to interact with, how you interact with them. And so it's more like a top down process than a bottom up process, if that makes sense.
Mm. And so these things that these I don't know what are they called, traits then, that influence how you perceive others, that are they called traits? Is that correct?
No, I mean, when you say traits, I think that what you are thinking of is kind of the way that psychology talks about personality traits. And it's not like that. I mean, personality, I don't tend to believe in personality, so it's not a concept that I would use. But it's more the ideology itself is a kind of think about it as an operating system in your brain, right? So, like if you are on your computer, it's the thing that decides, are you going to do Word today? Are you going to do Excel? Are you going to do PowerPoint? It helps you process what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. I think of ideology as functioning like that, but that comes out of a whole host of genetic traits as well as environmental inputs, right? So it's a very complex process, and I don't want to oversimplify it. But it's an orienting program, right? That has lots of downstream consequences for uh, perception, for physiology, for all kinds of attentional factors. What you look at when you see a video or a picture, what you pay attention to, who you prefer to interact with, all those things can be influenced. Again, not decisively, but influenced um, by these ideological traits that come out of an interaction between your genetic predisposition and these environmental factors.
And these things that you're maybe paying attention. I think I watched a TED, or not a TED talk, but talks on Google from you, where you I think you showed a picture on how different people actually look at on a picture. I think that on the picture there was a snake or something. I'm not quite
Yeah,
sure.
that's
And
exactly right. That's exactly right. So if you look at a picture, whether it's a still, we did it with still pictures, but you'd get the same thing with videos. you know, you can actually predict what part of pictures someone looks at based on their ideology. So, like conservatives, if you look at a picture that the classic picture we have is a spider on someone's eye, right? So, conservatives tend to look at the spider and liberals tend to look at the eye, right? So, it affects what you're actually paying attention to. And the reason that matters is that so much of the debate that I hear is this notion that the problem is just that we interpret the same information differently. And if we could just, sit down and have a conversation about it and debate about it and discuss about it, we can achieve some kind of consensus. And my whole thing is no, it's not that we are interpreting things differently. We're actually perceiving things differently. We hear different things, we see different things, we pay attention to different things based in part on political ideology. And so when we discuss, we think that we're having a disagreement over interpretation, but we're actually having a disagreement about perception itself. We just don't
wow,
know that.
so it's in a
But
way
people
as
don't
if
think that. They think that like I can just convince you. Well, that's like
yeah.
convincing you that the color blue is the color yellow. You can't convince somebody of something that they literally don't perceive in the same way.
Can it be predicted the other way around as well? Like we can see that, or we can predict that. I think you said liberals tend to look at the eye instead
Yeah,
of the
liberals love
spider,
to
or
look at
some.
eyes. Yeah, liberals are big on eyes.
And the other way around, can I say someone who looks at the eye is probably a liberal?
Um, Honestly, I don't know about that. I haven't seen data about that one way or another, so I don't know. I think it probably works the other way around, just that, um, liberals tend to pay attention. It doesn't mean that they don't pay attention to other things. It's just that they're going to be focused on the eyes. Probably because the eyes are really good. They're the best indicator in facial expression of emotion. And so when you pay attention to the eyes, you're really getting emotional information about the person behind the eyes, right? Whereas conservatives tend to pay attention to threats, whether that's the spider or the snake or a gun or, whatever it is, they're much more attuned to the threat in the environment. And liberals are much more attuned to kind of the, emotional aspect as seen through eyes of other people. Again, not 100%, but averages, pretty strong averages work in that direction.
Are these the main two things that we're able to find that you were able to find out? Like, meaning emotional triggers and threat triggers that they are in a correlation with liberals and conservatives, or are
Well,
there other factors that that also
there's
correlate
lots of
with
other
conservatism and liberals?
pieces, right? Like again, it's an orienting program. So when we do the eye tracking studies, that's one of the main things that we find. But there's other kinds of studies looking at other things. So, for example, when you look at other kinds of eye tracking studies, uh, you'll see that liberals pay attention to adornment, jewelry, hairstyle, things like that. And conservatives tend to be very focused on things that are sexual, so they'll pay more attention to like a lip lock and a kiss or breasts or butts or things like that. So they tend to have much more attention to sexual things, whereas liberals tend much more to pay attention to adornment.
Hmm. Is there any idea as to why that is? Any
I
thesis?
mean, there's speculation, right? I mean, you can't know, but I think there's various hypotheses. The way that I think about it is from an evolutionary perspective, right? That um, evolutionarily, it's valuable to have both liberals and conservatives. You don't want an environment where everything converges to one group or another because you need conservatives sort of for defense and protection. You need liberals for, cooperation and, building things and so on. And so you need both those groups to work in harmony. So when I think about the adornment thing, I think adornment is a lot about um, trying to attract a mate and trying to attract the best, highest quality mate possible. I think a lot of the conservative attention to sexual stuff actually is kind of a defense, right? Like there's a lot of attention that conservatives pay to purity issues that liberals don't tend to pay to purity issues. This comes out of work by Jonathan Haidt, looking at the differences between liberals and conservatives and the kinds of things that they pay attention to. So, like liberals and conservatives tend to pay attention to, fairness and, that kind of thing. But conservatives also pay more attention to things like purity and authority than liberals do. And so I think that there's a lot more attention on the conservative side to purity. And so that means putting up defenses against any kind of sexual arousal if you want to privilege purity. That's just a hypothesis. I mean, it might not be right. There might be all kinds of other things going on, but that's the way I tend to think about it.
So in a way, they're evolutionary. How is it? I think aren't a lot of these ideas of genetically or advantages or genetic differences formed on the thesis of evolutionary advantages. So how would it be evolutionary advantageous to me or for me to rather look at the spider, but for someone else who's living in the same community to look at something else?
Yeah. So when you look at genetics, you're really looking at individual differences. But when you think about evolutionary psychology, you're really thinking about human universals, the way in which everybody's really similar. But at a community level, it's good to have somebody who's paying attention to the threats. You can think about it like circadian rhythms too, right? Like it's good to have people who stay up all night and protect the village from animals that come in, and it's good to have people who, uh, you know, um, get up early in the morning and, forage or whatever, right? And so those kinds of differences become valuable for the overall group over time. And, um, you know, individual differences around things like not just chronotype, like waking up early versus staying up early, but being good about defense against the community of predators or bad weather, or especially other people, right? Other groups which present a danger. It's important to have people who can defend against that and who see the threat early and protect you against that threat early. And it's also important that you have people within the group who can engage in cooperative activities, not just building homes and shelters, but raising kids, which is a really, really hard thing. And you need lots of people to be able to do it. And you're not going to propagate the species without it. So you both need cooperation within the in-group as well as defense against the out-group. And so both those things are really important to have. And those are, think about them as human universals. There's not a community across time or across space that didn't need both those things, right? That didn't need to make decisions and choices about war and conflict, right? Like when you have another group that threatens you, that have to make decisions about resource allocations, who gets the food that you have, the food that you grow, and also things related to sex and reproduction, who gets to, father children, who gets to raise children, who has to have children, those kinds of things. And the way that those underlying challenges emerge changes given the time and given the place, but the underlying essential challenge remains the same. So it might look like debates over prostitution and pornography in 18th century England, but in current American context, it may look like debates over trans bathrooms, right? So the specific topic changes, but the central underlying factor, which is who gets to decide who controls sex and reproduction, is exactly the same. It just looks differently across time and space, but the underlying evolutionary challenge remains the same.
So, if they are human universals, the reference study with what the perception, what is perceived mainly, like the spider or the eye, have this study been made in different cultures?
Um, Not that I'm aware of. That doesn't mean it hasn't been done. We did it in a kind of American context.
But you would assume that the same findings would be that the same things would be found in, let's say, China if it would be replicated.
I would assume that you would see differences in the predisposition of people, seeing threat, for example. But the percentage of the population that is liberal versus conservative may be different. So we have looked at, liberal versus conservative across many continents, across many years, so 50 years, 5 continents. And you do get these very systematic differences between liberals and conservatives on lots of other factors. And that is true across cultures and it is true across time. It's just not necessarily a study that's been done with the eye tracking stuff, right? But you see these systematic differences across time and across space around differences in political ideology. That doesn't mean that a given population won't have more conservatives or that a given population won't have more liberals. It just means that, you see these systematic differences in groups across time and space.
And in your in the talk at Google, you actually also referenced or said that humans can smell these differences. Did I understand that right?
Yeah, so we did some studies based on a paradigm that was actually done looking at sexual attract. The original work was done looking at sexual attraction with regard to immune system function. So there's really wonderful work that was done by Marty Hazelton and Kelly Gildersleeve and some other people earlier too, looking at using a paradigm that involved T-shirts that people basically sweat into, and then you have other people smell it. And what they found is that people find individuals with a different immune system much more attractive than those who have a similar immune system. This is the major histocompatibility complex immune system. And that makes sense, right? Because if you have somebody with a different immune system function, then your children are going to be protected against a wider array of
Mm.
illnesses and diseases. If they're the same, you have much less coverage, right? And so we thought, well, maybe some of that is also related to political ideology, because if you actually look at the way that political ideology emerges in, across the genetic spectrum, it overlaps with a lot of the genes that code for smell. And smell is a very individual characteristic. It's not like taste. Smell is something that is very individual to each person. So we did, a very similar study where we took extreme liberals and extreme conservatives and had other people smell the basically pads that came from their underarms, and ask them a bunch of questions like, would you find this person trustworthy? Do you find them intelligent? Do you think that they would be aggressive? And there was no kind of consistency on anything except the question about how attractive you would find them. And you could predict um, ideological similarity based on what they found attractive. So somebody who found a smell attractive was much more likely to be aligned in political ideology, conservative, conservative, or liberal, liberal. Now,
Hmm.
note that's different than what you expect with immune system function, where you want somebody who's different. With ideology, what you're finding is people really like people who are the same. And so that was, and that emerged. It wasn't just interesting how strong it was, but the fact that it was unique. Like none of these other factors, how trustworthy you find someone, how intelligent you think they are, how aggressive you think they are, none of that stuff emerged as statistically significant. But the attraction question was. What was interesting about that is we asked, do you think this person is a liberal or conservative? And they didn't know. They couldn't tell you. But you could predict it based on who they found attractive. So basically, they're finding somebody attractive in an automatic, effortless way without any conversation, based on political ideology, but that's not about having a conversation about political ideology, right? It's not about sitting down and having a beer at a bar and having a conversation about whether you're a liberal or a conservative. It's automatic, it's effortless, it's nonverbal, and it's powerful. But it's completely independent to your conscious realization of whether somebody is liberal or conservative.
Wow. Now, what does that say for mating culture? So we generally go or are probably um, bonded to someone who's this our same who has our same ideology. Also,
Yeah. And it
but
makes sense. Like if you think of the way that matchmakers used to work, right? Matchmakers used to work when it was people, by matching families on things like similar values. And when those values come down, those values are a lot about political ideology. So if you look at long-term marriages, right? Marriages who are like more than 30 years. There's only three things that they match on more than you would expect by chance. One is religion, and that's almost entirely environmental. It's like where you grow up in that community. And you're more likely, if you're Jewish, you're more likely to meet other Jewish people. If you're Catholic, you're more likely to meet other Catholic people, that kind of thing. The other is political ideology, which, as I've mentioned, is highly heritable. It's genetically informed. And the third is drinking frequency, right? Alcoholics like to be around other alcoholics, and teetotalers like to be around other teetotalers, right? Everything else is just random. And so you think that, you put up a profile on a dating site and you think that it's about what you like to do or when you like to sleep or, what kinds of activities you engage in, what kind of employment you have. All that stuff is completely uh, orthogonal and epiphenomenal to whether or not the marriage is going to last statistically. Now, that's not necessarily true if you look at marriages that last, say, under 7 years, because a lot of that's driven by hormones. And then once you blow it off, the marriage is over. But the reason that I think that this matters is that I think society is messing with itself in a profound evolutionary way with all these dating apps, where you meet somebody online and you're having a conversation and you invest in them before you meet them. That's very different than chemistry that happens in this automatic, effortless,
Mm.
nonverbal way that millions of years of evolution has informed, right? The way that people used to meet in person, not necessarily in a bar, but, maybe in your job, maybe in your church, maybe in your bowling league, whatever it is, but it's in person. When you do it online, it means that you are automatically discounting tons of people that you would get along with really well because they don't look the part in a completely abstract way. And you're investing in people who probably the minute you see them, the minute you smell them, are like, ugh, but you've already invested months in them. It's completely ridiculous. And so I think that we're ending up through these. I mean, I think, social media is the most destructive force ever, but this particular aspect of it, I think, is seriously affecting um, not just mating, but the way childbirth will happen. And I think the best evidence is just the demographic collapse. I mean, you're looking at nobody's getting married, nobody's having kids. It's a huge problem in, China and Japan and South Korea, but it also is in America. It's just that it doesn't show up in America because we have a lot of immigration. Um,
But do you think that has to do with modern dating culture,
oh
meaning
yeah, absolutely.
dating apps?
Oh,
That data already
absolutely.
shows. Okay.
Well, why do you think governments like China in particular, and now Japan, and South Korea, the government is funding these in-person, basically versions of speed dating because they want people to get married. They want people to have kids because they're freaked out about who the hell is going to pay for all the old people who are living too long, right? Because there aren't any kids being born. Well, why are there no kids being born? Because people aren't getting married and they aren't having kids. Now, some of that is not just about the factors I'm talking about. A lot of that has to do with changing roles around caretaking responsibilities and the fact that men don't want to do it and women don't want to do it and nobody wants to do it. And so, whatever. But a lot of it also has to do with like, why would you want to marry and meet somebody that you kind of find aversive? Um, and you're not meeting the people that you wouldn't find aversive because you never get off your computer screen. It's really it looks like it's a minor problem. And I think that evolutionarily, it's a pretty big problem because it's novel, right? I mean, this is not the way that people for millions of years met each other and married each other and had kids together. It's just not.
Hmm. Well, I would have thought the people that now account for the lack of children are an older generation that doesn't necessarily use or have used dating apps. That's why I was
Well,
irritated.
no, I mean, the generation that's now having kids, that's how they're trying to meet, right? I mean, the older generation, they've either had kids or they haven't. Remember,
Hmm.
female reproductive capacity, without IVF and stuff stops around 40. So, the generation that you're talking about now, they that would be having kids are people that, not everybody, but a lot of them are meeting on apps. That and I'm not saying all these marriages are bad, right? Like and forget marriage. I'm not saying all these mating experiences are bad. Um, I'm just saying that it's different than it has been evolutionarily.
It should at least then lead to more conversations between liberals and conservatives, I would assume, right?
Well, no, there's less, right? You get
There's less,
more polarization. Sure. I mean,
but
people
usually
on
you
an
would
app will
just meet.
discount.
Usually, you would just talk to someone who smells the part, who smells like
Right.
the preferred ideology, and now you can't smell him, so you still text him, even though he's has another
Right, but
ideology, and you
there's
might have
other
a conversation.
factors, right? I mean, that's not the only factor that matters. There's also factors like immune system function, right? And those kinds of things as well. And so, it used to be the case that, I mean, for many years, and I'm not saying it's a good thing, basically rich men would marry beautiful women, right? I mean, that was the kind of historic thing. But it also means that women didn't have the ability through education and family to kind of exert their own independent political ideology. what you get now are liberals marrying liberals, conservatives marrying conservatives. And so you get increasing polarization over time because their kids are more likely to be what they are, right? Because you don't get as many of these blends of, liberal and conservative as you may have in the past because other factors like economic um, factors would have mattered more. Now, remember too that marriage and childbearing is hugely affected by class, right? That when you, um, it's like affected by class the way that it used to be affected by race in the 50s, right? So you have kind of two groups of people. You have people who kind of go to college, they get married, they have kids, they make a lot of money, and they engage in a lot of intergenerational transfer of wealth, right? They have a lot of money they give to their kids. And then you have a group of people who don't go to college, who have a lot of kids, who don't get married, who have no wealth, and who can't give that wealth to their children, right? So you get increasing bifurcation by class as well. Um, and so, you've got a lot of other factors going on. So I don't want to oversimplify it, but I think that these ideological factors are becoming increasingly polarized. It's also the case that on average, conservatives have more kids than liberals do, right? So that you also have not just polarization, but you have asymmetry. Um, that's probably a function of the fact that if you actually look at the kind of sex that people have, conservatives tend to have more sex that you'd consider reproductive potential sex, right? They have a lot of missionary sex. And so they have more kids. And liberals have a lot of sex that is not necessarily reproductively as likely. And so, you end up with populations where over time, as it becomes increasingly polarized, it will also become increasingly conservative without other interventions.
Wow, that is totally different
I mean, conservatives
uh,
are interesting, right?
angle, I guess,
They
actually.
have conservatives have more sex with fewer people and they're happier with the sex that they have, right?
Hmm.
Liberals tend to have less sex with more people and are way less happy with the sex that they have. Probably because all they're doing is thinking about the other better sex they could be having with somebody else, right? Like, think about it like the way I think about it. This is an odd analogy, but the way I think about it is like bread in the Soviet Union, right? So, like in the Soviet Union, if you found bread, you were really happy to have bread and you would just eat the bread you got and you felt really lucky. And then you move to the United States and there's 16,000 different kinds of bread and you don't know which bread to get. And, whatever bread you have, you're thinking about the other kind of bread you could have been having instead, right? It's the art of choosing. It's, Sheena Iyengar's work on this. When you have a lot of choice, it's harder for you to make any choice at all. And you're way less happy with the choice that you have, right? So that has implications for the sexual preferences of conservatives and liberals in that regard.
Do you know any data? Are there more men that are conservative, or or are men
So
generally more conservative or liberal, and are women more conservative or liberal?
what's interesting about that is I've seen data from the United States. I can't speak to the rest of the world that show that younger men are increasingly conservative and younger women are increasingly liberal, but it tends to be around this issue of abortion, right? It's really around reproductive choice. Um, I don't know how real that is because I don't know how the studies were done and I don't know how representative they are. But I've now seen several surveys that indicate that. And so that could be something that's happening. But again, I don't know how widespread that is outside the United States.
And aside from younger populations,
Um, I, th- I would have to look it up. I don't remember off the top of
okay,
my head.
okay. Coming back to the uh, to the communities in which there might be actually an advantage if you have someone that is more threat focused and someone that is more
Yeah.
corporation focused, for example. One thing that I still didn't quite understand is I mean, isn't the smallest community there is in a way a family? And
Oh,
wouldn't there be also an advantage if you have one person that is threat focused in that community, in that family, and one person that is focused on the emotional things, for example. So why are they is the tendency to go have the same ideology in couples?
Well, I think that you didn't necessarily have that historically. Like, we don't know, right? I mean, I think that your point is very well taken. The family is the most fundamental and universal political institution. You cannot find another political institution that is as universal across time and space. And it's where people learn all kinds of lessons, including those about aggression and whether or not their parents compromise and, achieve a consensus, or whether one person engages in physical coercion toward the other. And then they grow up applying that lesson to the wider world, right? And so I think that you do have lots of families where one person is more threat focused, the other person's more cooperative. But you also have families where just look at the rates of domestic violence and abuse. You have a lot of families where there's enormous amounts of aggression. And you would assume that some part of that is because of misalignment in, values and ideology. Sorry, that's my cat. And so, again, you just need to remember that these things are not absolute. There's huge variance. It's just that there tends to be tendencies in the majority, but that doesn't mean that there aren't exceptions.
Hmm.
Does that make
Uh,
sense?
I think it does. I think I understood it. What about people who have a change in their ideology? They grow up, and at first they're leaning towards a more liberalist view, and then later on become more conservative.
Well, remember, ideology, genetics are not destiny, right? It's a contributing factor, but the environmental inputs really matter. And the environmental inputs can shift which genes get upregulated, which get downregulated. In other words, which get expressed and which don't. And very powerful things affect that. So, in that regard, I think about adverse childhood events, really powerful things that happen to you as a kid. Your parent dies, your parent is incarcerated, your parent beats you up, you see your father kill your mother, those kinds of things. But also, there's pretty good data that things that happen later in life, for example, divorce, tends to really change people's political ideology. So, you can enter into a tendency from a particular ideological perspective, but you can have an environmental input that shifts that. And the reason that that's important is, again, these things aren't deterministic. And so they can shift because we need to be responsive to our environment. If we had genes that weren't responsive to our environment, we wouldn't survive, right? Like, we need to be able to take in input from the environment and respond to it in ways that allow us to still continue to thrive and survive. And so those environmental inputs can have positive impacts, they can have negative impacts, but they certainly can be powerful enough to change your political ideology depending on how extreme they are and how common they are.
I was wondering, do you actually happen to know a colleague of you, Professor Danigal G. Young?
No.
I had her on the podcast, and she was studying media news commentary, basically, and what she found out was that in general, more liberal news anchors tend to go for content, or content is more liked by liberals, and that on the conservative side you have more outrage content. And
Mhm.
I thought that might be interesting with regards to
That is
the
really
threat
interesting.
factor.
Yeah, and it makes sense, right? Like, I mean, when I think about the satire that's, really popular, like Jon Stewart or Stephen Colbert, it is that kind of liberal satire. Um, I think outrages can be used strategically on both the left and the right? Because John Tooby did quite a lot of work on this that, uh, really examined the role of outrages in sparking group solidarity, right? So if I'm trying to get a lot of people behind me to join in some conflict, one of the easiest ways to do it is to say, look at those awful things that group did to me. And if
Mm.
you don't join with me, not only is that group going to continue to do awful things, but they're going to do even more awful things, right? So there's an incentive to um, um, exacerbate the outrages that the other side does, to consolidate support on your side. And so sometimes it's manufactured and sometimes it's just amplified. But it serves a very strategic purpose, and it happens on both the left and the right. I mean, you can see it in the media environment on both the left and the right. So I don't think it's exclusive to um, the conservative side. I've seen it on both sides, but I think it's a very powerful tool.
Yeah, that's basically also what she said. There's obviously also outrage content on the liberal side. She mentioned Rachel Maddow, for
Yeah,
example. I don't watch a lot of U.S. news, but I think actually I know that
yeah.
name. But she said that outrage content on the liberal side is less outrageous than on the conservative side, the outrage content, and that in tendency there's more satire, more on the liberal side, and more outrage on the conservative side.
Yeah,
I
I'd just
just
be
found it
really,
interesting because of the threat
it
factors.
is really interesting. I'd be really curious how she measures outrage. I don't know the work. I'd have to go look at the work, but um,
If you want, maybe I can get you in contact.
yeah, I'd like that. That would be really interesting.
One other topic I would like to get in to real quick is uh, in recent years you studied prospect theory in international relations. Uh, could you explain quickly what is prospect theory?
Yeah, and I have to start this by saying Danny Kahneman died yesterday, and it's just a huge, tragic loss. I mean, he was 90 years old. He had a great run, but it's just a devastating loss. And he and Amos Tversky developed prospect theory, published the original work in 1979 in Econometrica. And it basically transformed the way that economists as well as psychologists think about risk and how risk is understood and assessed. One of the most powerful aspects of prospect theory is loss aversion, which is basically the argument that losses hurt more than equal gains make you happy. So, just a really simple example, losing $10 makes you feel worse than finding $10 makes you happy. And it's probably at a factor of about 2.5. So, to have that be equal, you would have to, find $25 to make you as happy as losing $10 makes you unhappy. But of course, it applies to all kinds of things, right? Like if I give a student an A, maybe they're happy for a day, but if they get an F, they're pretty unhappy for a long time, right? So there's a lot of asymmetry in the way that we understand loss. What that means is people will take much greater risks to avoid and compensate for losses than they will to achieve greater gains on average. And there's again, a real asymmetry in the slope on the positive side versus the negative side, what you'll do for gains versus what you'll do for losses. And so, in my very long time ago dissertation work, I applied those concepts to various decisions in American foreign policy. But the original work was done in psychology with financial bets, basically like lotteries that you would play in a gambling game. But there's all kinds of really important applications that have been done since that time to mathematics, statistics, health, law, medicine, policy, all kinds of things.
What it basically says is also that humans are not rational, right?
Oh, yeah, not rational in the way that economists think of rationality, right? So, you know, uh, one of the things that drives me crazy all the time is that rationality is always understood in economic sense, like how much money you gain versus how much money you lose. But there's a different kind of rationality, which is an evolutionary one, which is about survival. And that involves all kinds of things like social capital that can't be financialized or monetized as easily as people think that it can. And I think the best example for that is like during the pandemic. Yes, money mattered, but a lot of what really mattered was your social network because people were so isolated, right? And so I think that it's much more accurate to think of rationality in terms of the things that are necessary for, if you will, our genes to survive and thrive and move into the next generation than in terms of like cost benefit analysis from an economic standpoint. But if you're looking at it from a cost benefit analysis from an economic standpoint, absolutely prospect theory demonstrates that people do not behave in what economists would think of as rational terms around lots of stuff.
And when you take prospect theory and use the thought concept for international relations, that means that you basically try to understand um, how there might be different gains also besides monetary ones, or I don't understand how that converts then.
Oh, yeah. No, it's about how leaders, let's say a president, makes a decision about, let's say, responding to a threat. Under what conditions will they take a risk to overcome a sunk cost in a conflict, for example, versus when they would take a risk to gain additional territory in a conflict, right? So it's more about how individual leaders make decisions about how to respond to risk, what they see as a gain, what they see as a loss, when they're willing to take greater risks and when they're not willing to take risks in order to recoup particular kinds of losses.
Okay, but it's from an individual perspective.
Yeah, it's about the individual leader
Ah,
and the individual decision maker.
interesting.
So the original work was about decision theory, right? It was about how an individual makes up their mind. Now, that doesn't mean that, you can't have controversy where advisors may advise leaders to go in different directions. And, it's not necessarily a strict mathematical equation about how leaders integrate advice from advisors. But ultimately, especially in the realm of foreign policy around decisions like war and peace, the leader has a lot more degrees of freedom than they do in, say, tax policy, domestic tax policy, or something like that, where Congress has to get involved immediately and stuff like that. So, under those circumstances, you can look at how leaders integrate advice from different advisors, but also how they themselves render their decisions about whether or not to go to war, whether or not to use nuclear weapons, whether or not to, pursue a conflict under conditions of threat.
Okay, so it's from an individual perspective because what I was also asking myself when I wrote down this question is um, I watched a talk from Professor Mearsheimer, I think his name is,
Yeah,
and I think he said that he himself looks at the world from a, I think, neorealistic or
yep,
neorealism perspective, and he
that's
tried
it.
to explain, or I tried to understand what that means when he explained it, and I think he said that that it means that that he believes that states in general are acting in their own best interest, so that they're
That's
more or
right.
less rational. And I
That's
thought
right.
that's what your analysis of prospect theory also goes
No,
into.
yeah, that's an important distinction. So, in international relations, this is referred to the levels of as the levels of analysis problem. Like, which level of analysis do you look at? And so, Mearsheimer, as a realist, looks at the kind of state level. How states deal with each other at the international level. People who adhere to that paradigm don't tend to think individuals make a difference. But the
Hmm.
individual level of analysis, which is where I work as a political psychologist, says yes, individuals can make a difference. They do make a difference. And so we try to examine the ways in which they might make a difference or how that might look. So we start from fundamentally different assumptions about who's making the decision and what to pay attention to in examining that decision.
So from your level of analysis, neorealism couldn't be in its way correct, I would assume, since humans, because of prospect theory, basically,
Well, not
because
just prospect
humans.
theory. I mean, there's lots of other psychological models and other models, not even at those levels of analysis, levels of analysis at the domestic level that say what really matters is whether a state's a democracy or a monarchy or an authoritarian regime. Like there's other states of analysis, there's other levels of analysis that matter. Um, I don't think that a state makes a decision. I think people make a decision, but that's a fundamentally different perspective on what you pay attention to and who you think is actually acting. When realists talk to me about, the state does this, well, who is the state? Who are you talking about? What do you mean? But for them, that's a very viable uh, level of analysis from which to examine foreign policy and state behavior. I'm, you know, and they consider that parsimonious, and they get a lot of leverage out of that. And there's very valuable, important insights that come out of that, including the way in which different amounts of power can affect what a state is able to do. But I tend to just be much more curious about the individual level and who are the leaders making these decisions? Why are they making these decisions? It's a more complex way to look at it, but I also think it's more descriptively accurate. But, reasonable people have reasonable disagreements about these kinds of things.
Thank you very much, Rose. I think this is extremely interesting. I could talk to you with 4 hours, since I'm learning so much new things and thinking in different ways. But I would like to do one more segment, and that is the
Okay.
rapid fire questions at the end.
Okay.
And I hope you're ready for them.
I'll try.
I would be pleased if you could answer in 1 to 2 sentences, so
Okay.
that they are really rapid fire.
Okay.
And yeah, are you ready?
I'm going to try. Try my best.
What are you, to your opinion, the best sources to inform oneself and learn about international relations?
Well, it depends. This is a hard question because it depends on whether you want like current events, in which case, you're better off with vetted news agencies, or whether you want kind of underlying information about international relations theory, where you're better
Let's
off
let's do
with
both. Let's do both.
well,
For current events, what
for
would
current
you
events, I
recommend?
stick with the kind of vetted things. So, in an American context, NPR, PBS, the public broadcasting systems that have vetted knowledge, established news agencies, but across the political spectrum, right? So the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the, Washington Post, the Atlantic, the New Yorker, the Nation, those kinds of things. For international relations theory, again, it's going to depend on your paradigm, right? Like if you're a realist, you're going to go back to Hans Morgenthau and read Politics Among Nations. And I'm totally failing with the 2-sentence answer, but my kind of Bible around this is Bob Jervis's Perception and Misperception in International, Politics, which I think is one of the best books ever written on international relations. And he died a couple of years ago, and it's just a phenomenal loss. But if you want one-stop shopping, that's mine.
The other questions will be a little bit easier, I promise,
I hope.
or easier to answer quick. Do you have a favorite quote?
Yeah. Social science progresses one funeral at a time. I think it's from Max Planck, actually.
If you had a big billboard, let's say on Times Square, everybody would see it. What would you put on it?
I wouldn't do it because I don't think that you can actually get across complex notions in a billboard. I don't think it matters.
What's your newest, biggest insight?
I don't know that I have one. I'm going to have to take a pass on that one. I don't know that I have big insights these days. The world is broken.
That could be one.
Yeah, the world's pretty broken. Sad.
How? Then next question: how would you spend $1 billion to make the world a better place, to make it less broken?
I would spend it on improvements in maternal health care and mortality, because I think that the high rates of maternal mortality are unforgivable and preventable. And what people don't understand about the birth of terrorism is that it begins in utero. And that's where, the genetic factors really matter. And the kind of stress that women are put under in famine or war, conflict, or domestic violence affects not just them, but the next generation and generations in perpetuity. And so that's where I would spend the money. You want to stop terrorism? That's how to do it.
What would you have liked to know when you were 20? when you started?
Don't become an academic.
A controversial opinion, I believe what almost nobody else does.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't going to win me any friends, but one of the things that drives me crazy is how everybody privileges children over adults. Like, oh, children are dying. Like, somehow it's worse if a child dies than if an adult dies. When I get it, it's about the next generation, and children are seen as having unmitigated potential. But that means they have potential to be a terrorist as much as they have the potential to cure cancer, whereas
Hmm.
adults are actually doing stuff. And so that drives me crazy. And the other part of that is also the fact that when people are concerned about demographic collapse, and I understand why governments are because there's a real financial piece, I actually think it's good because we really need to reduce the number of people on the planet if we're going to have any hope for mitigating climate change before everybody is annihilated. So I actually don't think that demographic collapse is as bad from the planetary perspective as it is from the state based financial perspective.
What do you think about Daniel Kahneman?
He's was a towering intellectual figure who, you know, lived a remarkable life and who changed the way we think about how humans think. And it's a terrible loss that he died.
One other person we talked about. What do you think about Meir Sharma?
I think that he's a really um, important expositor of realist theory, although I disagree with him on many aspects of international relations, particularly, his recent positions on the Russian war in Ukraine and his longstanding positions about um, American-Israeli relations.
And what do you think about Kissinger?
I think he was a narcissistic, psychopathic war criminal.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time. It was really, really interesting. Like I said, I would love to have you on a second time at some point, if you were so pleased. And yeah, thank you, Rose. Do you have any last words? Any like a message you want to get out, or I don't know, a new project you want to promote?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head. Thank you very much for your very thoughtful and quite sophisticated questions. I appreciate that.
Thank you.